Story 1. The Craigslist Trap. My name is Alex, and this happened when I was 16. I had just started my first job and finally saved up enough money to buy a gaming PC. I couldn't afford anything brand new, so I turned to Craigslist. Back then, I naively believed that people were generally good, and bad things only happened to other people. After weeks of searching, I found what seemed like a perfect deal. A guy was selling a 3-year-old Alienware PC for just $200. The description said he'd recently upgraded and had no use for his old computer, but that it still worked perfectly. It sounded too good to pass up. I reached out to him, and he responded quickly. We exchanged a few emails, and he offered to meet at a grocery store parking lot the following evening. The location was 30 minutes away, which seemed a bit far, so I suggested meeting somewhere halfway. But he came up with excuses. He said he was too busy and couldn't drive far. If I wanted the computer, I'd have to pick it up near him. That gave me a weird feeling, but he seemed genuine enough. To ease my doubts, he sent me videos showing the computer was working fine and even promised to refund me if there were any issues. I decided it was worth the trip. The next evening, I arrived at the grocery store around 8 p.m. The parking lot was almost completely empty, except for an old, beat-up truck parked in the farthest corner. The store itself was closed, its lights turned off. The whole scene was eerie, and my gut told me something wasn't right. I pulled in and parked a safe distance from the truck, deciding to scope things out before getting out of my car. A man got out of the truck and looked toward me. He was in his late 40s or early 50s, with thinning hair and a rough, weathered look. His expression was unsettling. No smile, no greeting, just a cold, piercing stare. "Are you here for the computer?" he asked bluntly as he approached my car. I nodded, forcing myself to stay calm. He motioned for me to follow him to the back of his truck. When he opened the door, I saw the computer sitting on the far side of the back seat. It wasn't close to the door. I'd have to lean in or climb in to grab it. "Go ahead and check it out," he said, holding the door open. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The inside door handle was missing. It didn't take a genius to figure out what was going on. My mind raced as I stood frozen for a moment, pretending to consider his offer. Then I took a step back, muttering, "I forgot something in my car. Be right back." He didn't respond, just stared at me, his hand still gripping the door. I turned and walked briskly to my car, trying not to break into a full sprint. As soon as I got in, I locked the doors and started the engine. The man yelled something, but I didn't stop to listen. I sped out of the parking lot, glancing in my rearview mirror to see him rushing back to his truck. Strangely, instead of following me, he drove off in the opposite direction. When I got home, I told my parents everything. We reported it to the police, but without much to go on, just a fake-sounding email address. They couldn't do much. For days, I couldn't shake the thought of what might have happened if I had climbed into that truck. Every detail of the encounter replayed in my mind. The missing door handle, his cold stare, and how close I'd come to falling into his trap. I've never used Craigslist again. Maybe I was just unlucky, or maybe that man was waiting for someone like me, young and inexperienced, eager for a good deal. Whatever his intentions were, I'm grateful I trusted my instincts. Story 2. The Roommate Trap. Back when I was in college, I needed to find temporary housing for a couple of months. I didn't want to sign a 1-year lease for such a short time, so I turned to Craigslist. There were plenty of private listings for rooms to rent, and after a few failed attempts, I found one that seemed promising. The ad was for a room in a house about 20 minutes from campus. The photos weren't great, but the rent was cheap, and the landlord claimed to be a 22-year-old guy. After exchanging a few texts, we agreed on a time for me to check out the place. When I arrived, the neighborhood immediately set off alarm bells. The houses looked neglected, with overgrown lawns and broken fences. The house I was supposed to see wasn't any better. It looked like it hadn't been maintained in years. The door opened just as I approached, and I froze. The man standing there wasn't 22. He was at least 35, with long, greasy hair and faded tattoos on his neck. "You're here for the room?" he asked in a low, gravelly voice. I hesitated before nodding. He stepped aside and gestured for me to come in. Against my better judgment, I walked in. The smell hit me first, a mix of mildew and something metallic. The walls were stained, the floors warped, and the furniture looked like it had been salvaged from a junkyard. "Let me show you around," he said quickly, leading me down the hallway. His pace was strange, almost hurried, and he talked nonstop, barely giving me a chance to think. The kitchen was in terrible shape, with broken cabinets hanging off their hinges. He didn't stop to explain anything, just motioned toward the next room. "This'll be your room," he said, opening a door. The room was tiny, with nothing but a stained mattress on the floor. The window was boarded up, leaving the room in near darkness. I stood at the doorway, trying to think of an excuse to leave. But before I could say anything, I noticed the man's demeanor shift. His chatter stopped, and he stared at me with a cold, unsettling look. "You don't like it?" he asked, his voice quieter now. I stammered something about needing to think it over, but he took a step closer, his face twisted with anger. "You're wasting my time," he said, his voice suddenly sharp. Panic surged through me. I backed out of the room, but he followed, his movements quick and deliberate. I turned and bolted down the hallway, my heart pounding as I reached the front door. I yanked it open and ran to my car. As I got in, I glanced back to see him standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. I drove away as fast as I could, my hands trembling on the wheel. Looking back, the warning signs were there from the start. The fake age, the state of the house, his odd behavior. I realized I'd narrowly avoided something terrible. I didn't report it to the police because, technically, nothing happened. But deep down, I knew that man wasn't looking for a roommate. He was looking for a victim. Story 3. The cabin in the woods. Living in a rural area, Craigslist was the go-to place for buying used equipment. I needed a flatbed trailer for some construction work on my property, and after searching for a while, I found one that seemed perfect. The seller, a guy named Devin, responded quickly and invited me to come by his place to check it out. His property was about an hour away, deep in the woods. I'd done deals like this before, so I wasn't too worried. When I arrived, the driveway was a narrow gravel path that led to a small, weathered cabin surrounded by dense trees. Something felt off immediately. The trailer wasn't anywhere in sight. I figured it might be stored behind the cabin, so I parked and got out. I knocked on the front door and waited, but no one answered. After a minute, I got a text from Devin. Come around back. The text sent a chill down my spine, but I decided to check it out. As I walked toward the back, the woods seemed to press closer. But when I reached the corner of the cabin, I stopped. There was no trailer, just endless trees. That's when I heard it, the crunch of footsteps behind me. I spun around, but no one was there. My heart was racing as I backed away toward my truck. Then the footsteps got louder, closer. I glanced over my shoulder and saw him. Devin was charging at me from the side of the cabin. I didn't wait to see what he wanted. I sprinted to my truck, jumped in, and floored it. When I reached the nearest town, I called the police. They investigated and discovered that the cabin wasn't even supposed to be there. The property was listed as unoccupied land. Devin had no intention of selling me anything. He'd lured me there for something far worse.